Good afternoon. We're going to just jump right in here. John chapter 13 is where we're going to spend some time this afternoon. It's part of our teaching series, Illuminate. And here's what I want us to see, in particular from John chapter 13. Because Jesus models through his example and his teaching that the better life of Jesus personifies love and provides to us the model of a life of love and service. Let me say that again. The better life of Jesus personifies love and provides to us the model of a life of love and service. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. That does not mean that your life will be better, but a life of love and service that gives life to other people. That's a better life. When you came in today, you should have received one of these at the door. And I invite you just to take that out, take some notes, kind of walk through John chapter 13 this afternoon as we continue to talk about the better life. The name Dietrich Bonhoeffer may or may not be familiar to you, but this World War II era Christian martyr was a German pastor and theologian who wrote a classic book on the cost and what the cost of following Jesus of Nazareth truly means. The book's called The Cost of Discipleship, and it's molded and shaped the hearts and minds of a generation of mid to late 20th century Christ followers. And this is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote. He said this: "The cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering which every man or woman must experience is the call to abandon the attachments of the world. It is that dying of the old man which is the result of his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon our discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give over our lives to death." Thus it begins. And the cross is not a terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man or woman, he bids him or her come and die. It may be a death like that of the first disciples who had to leave home and work to follow him. Or it may be a death like that of Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, who had to leave the monastery and go out into the world, but is at the same death every time. Death in Jesus Christ, the death of the old man at his call. And that's what we find here in John chapter 13, where Jesus is explaining and, more importantly, setting the example for his disciples, for those who would claim to follow him, of what his life in this life will cost us. There's a couple of things that jump out from John chapter 13, and I want to talk about those very briefly. Here's the first thing that we see. Jesus demonstrates how to get over yourself. Jesus demonstrates pretty clearly how you get over yourself. Pick it up with the first verse from John chapter 13. Read along with me. Just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that the time had come to leave this world and to go to the Father. And having loved his dear companions, he continued to love them right to the end. It was supper time. The devil by now had Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, firmly in his grip, all set for the betrayal. And Jesus knew that the Father had put him in complete charge of everything, that he had come from God and was on his way back to God. So he got up from the supper table, set aside his robe, put on an apron. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with his apron. When he got to Simon Peter, Peter said, "Master, you wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but it will be clear enough to you later." And Peter persisted, "You're not going to wash my feet, ever." Jesus said, "If I don't wash you, you can't be part of what I'm doing. Master, said Peter, not only my feet then, wash my hands, wash my head. Jesus said, if you've had a bath in the morning, you only need your feet washed now, and you're clean from head to toe. My concern, you understand, is holiness, not hygiene. So now you're clean, but not every one of you. He knew who was betraying him. That's why he said, not every one of you. After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and then went back to his place at the table. Then he said, do you understand what I've done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee does not give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it and live a blessed life. And what's fascinating to me about this passage as we begin today is what Jesus knows. Our text indicates that he knows he's about to die. He knows that one of his closest friends is about to betray him. He also knows that everything is going absolutely according to the Father's perfect plan. The word that's used here for knew in the original language, the Greek language, is the word oida, and it conveys this idea that Jesus actually spent time thinking through and reflecting on all that was about to happen. And he did something that under any circumstance would have been considered extraordinarily beneath the Son of God. Just think about this account this way. Whenever any of us are going to have company or guests over to our house, what are some of the things that we might do? Everybody starts talking about cleaning. That's right. You clean because we all live like pigs, right? Everybody, we clean our house, right? We clean and we straighten up. We put things in order. And if they're staying overnight, we set aside towels and we set up a room. Except if you're Robert, I'll say it. He doesn't. No, if they're staying overnight, right? You go through all of these extra steps just to make sure everything is just right. And Jesus and his disciples lived at a time when the best of hosts were certain to provide water for the feet of their guests who were traveling. We see that same image if you look in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham provided water for the feet of his guests. You should read that story. Who those guests are is very interesting. But so they can clean their feet. But the very idea of taking care of someone else's nasty feet, that was a task that typically fell to the lowest servant, or to a very submissive wife, or to children. Can you imagine? Just think. Can you imagine the horror of the disciples? They knew exactly what he was doing when he got up from the table and started removing articles of clothing and then dressing in the clothing of a servant. I can only imagine that they were uncomfortably quiet. Jesus here demonstrates what it means to get over yourself. The image here is incredibly moving. The late Catholic evangelical Brennan Manning was waiting to catch a plane in an Atlanta airport. And he sat down at one of the many places where usually black men will shine white men's shoes. And an elderly black man began to shine Brennan's shoes. And Brennan had this feeling inside that after he was done, he should pay him, he should tip him, and then reverse the roles. And when Brennan was finished, he stood up. He looked at the black man and he said, "Now, sir, I would like to shine your shoes." And the black man recoiled and stepped back and said, "You want to do what?" He said, "I'd like to shine your shoes. Come on, you sit down here. How would you like them done?" And the black man began to cry. And he said, "No white man ever talked to me like this before." And the story ends with this old Catholic man and this black man hugging and crying together. They've only just met, but they're sharing life with one another. And what Jesus does in this passage, just as what Brennan did in that airport, it's just astounding. It's the ultimate and legitimate example of being a servant. Now, before we move on to observe another aspect of this better life with Jesus, I want us to look at this a little bit closer. And pick it up where Jesus says, do you understand what I've done to you? You address me as teacher and master. Rightly so, that's what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant's not ranked above his master. Employee doesn't give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it. Live a blessed life. You know, there are very few things that Jesus actually did himself in the pages of the New Testament that are normative or repetitive patterns that we actually should follow. For example, in a few weeks at Pelican Harbor, did you hear Pastor Jake? We're going to baptize people. Who baptized Jesus? John the Baptist. So we do the same thing, right? Also, we celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion. That actually, in this particular account here, this chapter, is kind of where that whole thing began, where we celebrate. But did you know that this is the only time in the life and ministry of Jesus that he specifically said he was leaving an example for his disciples to follow? So the question then becomes, when was the last time you washed someone else's feet? Now, some of y'all are sitting here thinking, I never washed anybody's feet. And you've been a Christian for a long time. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean that literally. Jesus is communicating to those of us who would be his disciples, we will imitate his example because he is our master. So my question is literal, not rhetorical. When husbands, Christ-following husbands, when was the last time you washed your wife's feet? Literally. Wives, when have you done that for your husbands? You know, I know that there's some of us in here who are single. We've been blessed to be single. Sisters, when have you washed another sister's feet? Or brothers, maybe there's another Christian brother that you could actually wash his feet. See, have you served one another in that very specific do as I do manner ever? Jesus says we're to do what he does. Oswald Chambers, an early 20th century Scottish Baptist and holiness missionary, holiness movement evangelist teacher, he said this. He said, our Lord did not say to his disciples, I've had a most successful time on earth. I've addressed thousands of people and become the means of their salvation. So now you go and do the same kind of thing. He said this, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. And we try to get out of washing the feet of those who are not of our own set, Chambers wrote. We will wash the non-believers' feet. We'll wash the feet of people in the slums. But fancy washing my brother's feet, or my wife's feet, or my husband's feet, or the minister of my church. Our Lord said, one another's feet. The better life is one of serving one another. This is how we get to the point where we truly get over ourselves. Jesus also models something else in this passage. Here's a second thing Jesus models for us. Jesus models what it means to not fool yourself. Okay? Jesus models what it means not to fool yourself. Pick it up in verse 18. Jesus says, I'm not including all of you in this. I know precisely whom I've selected so as not to interfere with the fulfillment of Scripture. The one who ate bread at my table turned his heel against me. I'm telling you all this ahead of time so that when it happens, you will believe that I am who I say I am. And make sure you get this right. Receiving someone I send is the same as receiving me, just as receiving me is the same as receiving the one who sent me. After he said these things, Jesus became visibly upset, and then he told them why. One of you is going to betray me. The disciples looked around at one another, wondering who on earth he was talking about. One of the disciples, the one Jesus loved dearly, was reclining against him with his head on his shoulder. And Peter motioned to him to ask who Jesus might be talking about. So being the closest, he said, "Master, who?" And Jesus said, "The one whom I give this crust of bread after I've dipped it." Then he dipped the crust and gave it to Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. As soon as the bread was in his hands, Satan entered him. "What you must do," said Jesus, do it and get it over with. And no one around the supper table knew why he said this to him. Some thought it was since Judas was their treasurer, Jesus was telling him to buy what they needed for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. Judas, with a piece of bread, left. It was night. Here's what I love. Here's what I truly love about Jesus in this account. Jesus does not fool himself, nor does he try to fool anyone around him. Jesus knew exactly what the stakes were, and he made it clear that he was aware of how bad things were, how bad they had yet to get still, but Jesus spoke the truth. Again, what Jesus knows comes into sharp focus as it relates to what's about to happen, how he's going to be betrayed by someone seated at the very table they are now seated, or more accurately, reclined at. The way meals such as this one in John's Gospel were eaten during this time, it's really interesting. And when you have the visual image in your head of what it might have looked like, it begins to make a little bit more sense as to why Jesus was asked what he was and where people were over the next several incidents, little things that happened in the same passage. So not only are the disciples trying to sort out the whole washing of their nasty feet that they just went through, but also this weird exchange that jump the gun boy Peter had with Jesus. Yes, no. But now in their presence, Jesus shares the most painful of truths. Someone in this room at this table is going to turn him over to the Jewish religious leaders and eventually the Roman authorities in order to be put to death. And after kind of being egged on by Peter, remember the verse says Peter motioned him. The him that Peter motioned to is the Apostle John. He motioned to him to ask Jesus who he might be talking about. So being the closest, he, or John, said, "Master, who?" And Jesus is asked a direct question about who the betrayer is by the Apostle John, and he doesn't miss a beat. "The one whom I give this crust of bread after I dipped it." Then he dipped the crust, gave it to Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. And as soon as the bread was in his hand, Satan entered him. "What you must do," Jesus said, do it and get it over with. I had a really good friend in high school who dated the same girl all during their high school days and all during their time in the same Christian college. You guys ever had people who dated one person whole time? They didn't date nobody else, just one person. And this was my friend. He did this. And then when they got to Christian college, they decided to get married. And my friend asked several of us guys, we all came from the same youth ministry. He asked us what we thought, and we all said, "Dude, do not marry this woman. Don't marry this girl. All you do is fight. Don't marry this woman. You are not going to stay married to this woman, and she's not going to stay married to you." But they got married. And a few short years after they finished college, their marriage was finished. A few years later, this same friend came back to us and said he was going to get married a second time. We were all like, "You got to be kidding me." Because we didn't know what to make of it all, because first of all, we hardly knew this soon-to-be next bride, and we weren't really sure he had done the work necessary to make sure he didn't lose the next wife. Well, we all had those conversations, but we never said anything to my friend. And finally, right before the wedding, we gathered at Aurelio's Pizza, which is, just for the record, the best pizza in Chicago, just so you know. We gathered at the Homewood location, which is where our youth ministry, every Sunday night, that's where we went after whatever we did. And so we're all sitting at the table, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And while he was at one end of the table, I was way at the other end of the table. And I finally just said, kind of everybody, said, hey, bro, we know you're going to get married to this new girl, but can you tell us what's going to be different this time? I mean, what's going to prevent you from divorcing this one like you did your last wife? And needless to say, there were some people who started gagging on their drinks and their pizza. But I just followed it up with this. I said, hey, we've all been saying this stuff over the last few weeks when he wasn't around. I just thought if we were really friends, I should just go ahead and say what we're all thinking. And maybe that was a bit rough. But I'm convinced that authentic love doesn't engage in whispering and propping up half-truths. There's no place to engage in self-delusion and the fooling of ourselves. And this is where we sacrifice wholeness, integrity, and truthfulness for a false peace. Where we don't say the really difficult, hard, and uncomfortable things we need to say or that need to be heard. And that is, in fact, the better life. See, that's the illuminated life. Jesus unashamedly models this when he's asked a direct question, who is it? Jesus says, this brother right here. Here's the deal. If you're coming to Westbrook every week and there's stuff going on in your life, and you're not being real about it, and you're putting on a happy face, and you're not sharing, and you're not being honest, that's a problem. That's not the better life. That's a life in hell. Okay? I'm just telling you. Reggie McNeil calls this aspect of Jesus' life the same life that Jesus wants for you and I. He calls this practicing greatness. But specifically, he writes that what Jesus is displaying here is a discipline of self-awareness. Reggie writes this, leaders, and I would say Christians actually, who operate without self-awareness run the risk of being blindsided by destructive impulses and confused by emotions that threaten to derail their agenda and leadership effectiveness. It's about following Jesus' model to not fool ourselves. This passage makes it clear that even with all that Jesus is aware of, even with all that he knows that's about to happen, Jesus is in complete control. You don't read through this passage and see a dude freaking out. Jesus has it all in control. He knows exactly what's going to happen. Jesus is living the better life. Jesus is modeling the better life. If you were here a few weeks ago, Pastor Mont preached on Jesus' approach to the man at the pool, remember? John chapter 5. If you haven't heard that message, you should go out and listen to it. It's a good one. Jesus spoke truthfully and pointedly with the man, and he simply told the man, oh, you want to get better? Then what? Just lay there on the ground? Oh, if you want to get better, just keep complaining? If you want to get better, just pray? No. What did he tell the man? You want to get better? Get up, right? Get up. Then in John chapter 4, the chapter right before this, Jesus is conversing with a Samaritan woman. And we don't see Jesus avoid the truth. And Jesus isn't mean. Jesus isn't nasty. Jesus is lovingly, truthfully, honest. He's transparent. And I love the fact that Jesus does not avoid the messiness of a moment. John simply asks, who is it? And Jesus straight up answers the question. And that's the example that we have to follow in order to keep from fooling ourselves into believing that we are living a better life. Jesus is demonstrating how you get over yourself. Jesus models living a life of truth and not fooling ourselves. Here's the last thing that comes to us from John chapter 13. Here's the last thing. Jesus explains how to live beyond yourself. Jesus explains how to live beyond yourself. Pick it up in verse 31. When he had left, meaning Judas, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is seen for who he is, and God seen for who he is in him. The moment God is seen in him, God's glory will be on display. And in glorifying him, he himself is glorified. There's glory all around. Children, I am with you for only a short time longer. You're going to look high and low for me, but as I told the Jews, I'm telling you, where I go, you're not able to come. And let me give you a new command. Love one another. In the same way I loved you, you love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see the love you have for each other. Simon Peter asked, Master, just where are you going? And Jesus answered, you can't follow me where I'm going. You will follow later. Master, said Peter, why can't I follow now? I'll lay down my life for you. Really? You'll lay down your life for me. The truth is that before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Jesus makes it very clear in this passage. If you missed it, it's not about you. When Jesus explains that this is a new command, he's actually taking the Old Testament command found in Leviticus chapter 19:18. Do not take revenge or bear grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. I'm your Lord. He takes that to an entirely new level. How's he do that in this passage? What do we see that's a little bit different? Listen to these words again. Love one another in the same way I loved you. You love one another. This is how everyone will recognize you are my disciples when they see the love you have for each other. We're to love exactly like Jesus loves, and that love is a self-sacrificing love. A love that realizes it's not just all about me. When I was just finishing junior high school, I, along with several other students, took a trip to JARS. Does anybody know what JARS is? That sound familiar to anyone? JARS is a Christian organization. It's Jungle Aviation and Radio Service. They were headquartered in North Carolina. And it was meant to be a time of challenge to young people to get them to think about how they would allow God to use them in service to His kingdom. And in order to save money on overnight accommodations, we asked several churches along the way to simply allow us to sleep overnight in their facility or perhaps to stay with families in their church. However, one of the churches that we were supposed to stay at had a last-minute change of plans, or so we were led to believe at the time. And our group was not able to stay in the church or with any of the families overnight. And it wasn't until many, many years later, actually, I just found this out a few years ago, I discovered the truth behind the sudden change in plans. The issue had become my presence with the group. This church made it clear that having me stay at the church or with a family in the church would be a problem because no one wanted to keep the colored boy. Now, y'all, as I recall, this wasn't 1952. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. This was like the late 70s, when the majority of people, particularly Christians, would readily claim, oh, racism, we're past that. But this church held firm. And my youth pastor, John, and his wife, Cheryl, held firm as well, telling the church that since the colored boy was not welcome, they considered none of our group to be welcome. And while I don't recall where we went or stayed that night, I know it wasn't with that church or any of the bigoted racist people that went to that church. This is what it means to live beyond yourself, see? My leaders decided, well, if you don't love one of us like Jesus says you should, you probably don't really love any of us, you racist bigots. Although they probably didn't say that. I just added that. And they put themselves out to love sacrificially, like Jesus. It's the road to a better life that Jesus offers. It's a better life that He Himself lived and calls us to live as well. It is an illuminated life. And I'll readily admit that living like this is a bit like living life on the Poseidon. Do you guys remember that movie? Poseidon Adventure? There's got to be a morning after. But they did a remake. The remake is really good. Right? In the movie The Poseidon Adventure, the ocean liner, the SS Poseidon, is out on the open sea. And there's this huge storm that hits the ship, or more precisely, what is known as a freak or rogue wave. The lights go out, smoke pours into the rooms, and amid all the confusion, the ship flips over. And because of the air trapped inside the ocean liner, it floats upside down. That's a bunch of y'all going, I am not going on a cruise now. We're going to cancel that one. Well, anyway, in the confusion, the passengers can't quite figure out what's going on, and they scramble to get out, mostly by following the steps to the top deck. What's the problem with that? Where's the top deck? The top deck is now 100 feet underwater. In trying to get to the top, survivors are a few who do what doesn't make sense. They do the opposite of what everyone else is doing and climb into the dark belly of the ship until they reach the hull. And rescuers hear them banging and cut them free. In life, it's as if God has turned over the ship. And the only way to find freedom is to choose what doesn't make sense. Lay down our lives by serving, supporting, sacrificing for others. That's the better life. So what do we make of this call to live a life of love and service? It's the same thing that we used to tell, Ruthie and I used to tell our kids when they were little and they were naughty. We'd always give them a choice. And we'd tell them, you get to pick. Friends, we get to pick. We get to pick whether we're going to live this better life. Will we love and serve like Jesus? No doubt it's going to be challenging, it'll be draining, it'll cause you to think and possibly think, what in the world am I doing this for? All these people, I just want to kill them. They are so demanding. C.S. Lewis was a well-known 20th century Christian author, and he wrote a series of books you may have heard of called The Chronicles of Narnia. He also wrote some timelessly classic books, The Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity. He's incredible. And regarding Christ's call to love and serve, Lewis wrote this. He said this, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in a coffin or casket of your own selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, still, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all of the dangers of love is hell. But this is what Jesus calls us to. He bids us to come. Live like I have lived. Love like I have loved. And die. The better life is the life that gives life to everyone, that serves everyone around them. Today when you leave out in the lobby is a study guide, study booklet we want to invite you to pick up that covers the second part of the teaching series that we are currently in this summer. Be sure to stop by and pick up one of these and just use it during the week as a way to study the principles, the things that God has to say to us from the Gospel of John. Let's take a moment. Let's pray together.